This is the October 28th, 2019 Kubernetes SIG release subproject release engineering meeting. This meeting is being recorded. It will be uploaded to YouTube. After we complete, we ask everybody to adhere to the Kubernetes Community Code of Conduct, please, which amounts to be great people. We're here to collaborate, and we have to behave in a certain way for that to happen efficiently. So today's agenda is in the normal place, which is linked off of the SIG list information in the community repo for anybody following along on the video. For people here, I've dropped it in the chat in Zoom. We don't have a lot of specific stuff on the agenda today, but as always, please put your name in the notes so we can see who is here. Do we have any new folks today who we might say hi to first of all? It looks like we've got mostly all returning people. So then that brings us into sub-project updates. And usually this is where Stephen tells us what all he's hacked up, and I see like 3 a.m. commits from him over the weekend. So Stephen, is there anything that you would like to chat about today?
Yes, sure. So I've been working on hacking on actually moving our builds, the build stage and release process from the Google infrastructure over to CNCF infrastructure. So the build process has been completed for a little bit, and that is people who are on the release engineering mailing list may have seen. Not the release engineering mailing list, but the GitHub team may have seen some of those PRs fly by. I am trying to pull up the PRs on my phone right now, but I took some time to aggregate kind of some of the stuff that I was working on in one place so that you can view it. So I've also tagged the release engineering project on a new PR that is a prototype of what it would look like to stage within the CNCF infrastructure. Now, give me a second. Okay. And here it is. Okay. So that's in the chat. If someone can drop that in the notes as well. So I can walk through this issue really quickly. So basically the first part of it was the build process. So what we wanted to see is if we could enable Kubernetes builds on the K8s infrastructure and do it via Prow. So the same way the CI Kubernetes build and CI Kubernetes build fast jobs run, see if we can wire that up to run as Google Cloud Build runs instead, and then plug those into Prow. So you'll see some of that checklist is actually turning the image builder into a generic, so the test infra image builder, which I did like a kind of walkthrough in one of the, I guess not last week's call, the week before that. I did kind of a walkthrough of what the image builder looks like. So wiring that up to be more of a generic GCB builder. So once that was done, I also added a bunch of prototype jobs, which you can view on the SIG release prototype blocking board. That board includes 2 jobs. One is the build master, and then build fast job. From there, I've been working on the staging process. So the first part of that, you may have seen like the alerts pop up into the channel about me pushing commits into, manually pushing commits into branches instead of PRs. So that was a creation of a feature branch called prototype. The prototype feature branch is essentially set so that, is essentially created so that we can do all of this work and then cut everything over cleanly. Instead of, so the reason behind that is essentially our staging process depends on some GCB cloud build files that are located in the release repo. So it's Kubernetes release GCB, and then there's separate folders, build, stage, and release, and each of those have a cloud build within them. So the cloud build if we were to change those today and the job was essentially half done, we would break the actual staging jobs, right? We not the actual staging jobs, but when a release manager actually runs a staging run, it would fail, right? Because it would try to land assets in a combination of the old infrastructure and the new. So the feature branch is there to essentially make sure that we can test out the new flow and do it cleanly without breaking the current flow for release managers.
I have a question there.
Yeah, sure.
At least a portion of that current flow is broken, the Google internal portion. Do you think we should roll back, like do some revert PRs so that instead of them building from well, I like the idea of them building from a tag, first of all, but the head is actually in a functional state also?
So no, I would prefer to roll forward. So they're working on the old tag because essentially what we've done is move some of the locations around for the deb and RPM builds. What I want to do is unify the tool that is building both the debs and RPMs, and then roll their tool internally forward, give them the expected inputs outputs. We still have to schedule a call for that, but I don't want to do that until I get closer to unifying the two. So the idea would be, so on the deb side, we run a uh, what we're calling, it's a module called deb builder, right? And then so it's a tiny Go script that essentially goes in. It looks through a bunch of directories. It looks at the dependencies for each of the packages that we want to build, and then it does its thing, right? And then on the RPM side, we do something very similar, except it's a super tiny bash script, right? So I would like to make sure those two things do the same stuff before we ask them to refactor any of the internal stuff. I don't think there's much value in us reverting the stuff at this moment. But someone feel free to chime in if they feel differently. Okay, all right. um, okay, so more of the weekend work. So on the staging side, I kind of broke stage and release up into 3 phases. There are probably more, and there are probably sub phases within these phases. It was just kind of a brain dump of the ideas that I had as I was working through some of these PRs. So the phase 0 is essentially staging only. Phase 1 is prod test, and then phase 2 is prod. Right, so in the staging only stage, we're creating the feature branch. There's a PR up that is essentially an initial prototype of some of these changes, and I tagged some of you on it earlier, so you might have already reviewed that. Let me just pop that into the chat as well. So that's that PR there. And essentially what I've done in that PR is tweak a few things so that we can configure buckets, or so that bucket names are consistent. It was hard-coded in a bunch of places. So some of the buckets and some of the GCRIO paths are configurable now, or more consistent. It also moves some things around that make assumptions based on whether or not you're a Googler. I removed all of that logic. I also temporarily disabled any checks that look for a GitHub token, right? So the reason behind that, and like each of the PRs within that, each of the commits within that PR, basically the ones that I want to drop are prepended with a tag that says drop. So each of those are essentially commenting out logic that would check for the GitHub token. Now, the reason behind that is the GitHub token that we use is stored essentially in KMS, right? So in the Kubernetes release test, KMS, GCP KMS API, right? So we can't use the credentials that we store in the Kubernetes release test, KMS on the new Kate's staging release test GCP project, right? And we also don't yet have access to the KMS API on the new projects. So there is yet another PR that I will pop into the chat. So there's another PR for the Kates.io repo. And essentially what that PR does is the first thing it does is it adds a Kubernetes release managers admins group, right? To our Kubernetes.io G Suite. So that group is meant to have elevated privileges on SIG release GCP projects, right? And the members of that group will be the SIG chairs, right? So the elevated privileges that we're referring to are things like being able to create GCS buckets, being able to admin KMS, and I think being able to push to GCR, right? So we're also configuring those projects, the PR also configures those projects so that people in the release manager's private group can access GCR as well as execute cloud builds. And we're also configuring the release managers at Kubernetes.io group, which is the release, which is essentially the aggregate of patch release team, branch managers, build admins, and the SIG release chairs, as well as the release manager associates, access to view cloud builds, the GCS buckets, GCR, and that's it, I think. So essentially just adding another level of granularity to the permissions that we have, and then making sure that those permissions exist on both the Kate's staging release test GCP project, as well as the Kate's, was it release prod test project or test prod project, something like that. So once that PR merges, I'll be able to configure KMS secrets for the GitHub token, and then reconfigure the cloud builds to store that token, right? To store the new token, or rather to store the same token, but the new secret for the new project. So does that all jibe so far? Okay, cool. So essentially what I've tested up till now, kind of Friday and over the weekend, were the stage flow for both mock and no mock, as well as the release flow for mock, right? The reason why I didn't test the reason why there's kind of an obvious reason why I didn't test the no mock release places that don't necessarily have the same vanity URLs that that we would come to expect. So one of them being dl.kates.io, which is a vanity URL for getting downloads of Kubernetes, or understanding where what the current versions are. So like download.kates.io/latest.txt or something would give you like the latest build for Kubernetes. And because dl.kates.io doesn't point to the new test prod yet, it doesn't make sense to use to try to cut any of that stuff over yet, right? I want to try to mock as much of this flow up without impacting any of our current flow. Then from there, we need to have a service account that essentially can break into prod test. So that's a service account that has access to store GCS objects from the staging bucket, basically being able to copy GCS objects from the staging bucket into the test prod buckets, right? And then after that, what else do we need to do? There's also somewhere in this, I'm going to be configuring Prow staging jobs. So what's kind of cool about this is we'll get to the point where these staging jobs will be running consistently and no mock, and they will be staging releases constantly, right? So I'm thinking we run them every 4 hours um, until we get some signal on how long the jobs take, as well as how much they cost, and then slowly move them into more of a nightly thing. Maybe run them once or twice a day, right? Just to, or maybe we can go from like 4 to 6 to 12, something like that. Once we get a better handle on all of the components that are involved in building out the new infrastructure. Now, there are a few more things. So the vanity URLs that I had mentioned, there's also gcr.io, which is our vanity URL for the prod registry. So there are some things that have to be done that I don't know all of the shapes of, which include like migrating the old images into, and not just like the old release images, but all of the images that exist on gcr.io into new prod, right, before we're cutting over that URL. And then there's also the fact that we need to figure out what image promotion looks like for staging. Right now, essentially what we do is the Anago will build the Docker images or the container images and then push that to the prod registry. What we would want instead is to push them to the staging registry, right? And then run a script that maybe either outputs the list of SHAs for those images, and then we follow the image promotion process, or maybe we have a script that actually will create the PR to do the image promotion, right? So we have to figure out how we want to approach that as well. So I yapped a bunch, but that's kind of what I've been working on in the background. So if anyone has questions on that, let me know.
So I've got a question on that prod discussion. So there are a number of things there that are TBD for the future, but kind of TLDR there felt like, how do we make sure that prod is the same, the new prod is the same as old prod? And I wonder how much that's necessary as a demonstration. Like, could we leave old prod there and instead of, so if we define all of the things that are going to be in new prod, ensure that they're there. Maybe it's not everything that's in old prod, depending on reasons or what we see. But we're talking about potentially making a break here intentionally. And I think that could be okay. Like there's a lot of random old things out there that we don't fully understand. But the one thing that I think we would need to do is anything that we're pushing to prod and new prod, that final output would also potentially need copied to old prod. So old prod in its weird kind of broken state for certain criteria could stay that way if people wanted to use it, but have a new place that was the alternative to move towards. Because I don't know that we can ensure that we haven't broken somebody's flow somewhere, but we could leave them in their state for a period of time. And then we also have to consider deprecation. So I imagine that we're going to have the two flowing in parallel for a period, because we can't just turn the old one off unless we've proved that it's exactly the same. So I feel like it might be an easier path to keep the two going together. I don't know what other people think.
Yes. Yeah. So I don't know how they're going to be handling container images just yet. It's less so the flow itself, and it's more so the fact that we know that people use these vanity URLs, right? So we have to make sure that if we cut those over, like if we use a staging.katesgcri.io or something as a pre-URL or a, I don't know, beta.gcri.io or something, right? Some URL that lets you know that it is clearly not the current version, right? That might be okay. We also have to make sure that as we're going about doing some of this stuff that we're pretty intently documenting how prod tests functions, right? Because the buckets that we're using right now, or the projects that we're using right now, Kate's staging release test, it's almost in the name that it's like a test of staging. It's not quite staging. I don't know if the intention was for this to be a test of staging or for it to be actual staging. Because if it's the former, then this could get interesting. And then there's also Kate's release test prod or prod test, right? And again, the name implies that it's clearly not the real prod, right? It's just a playground for us to figure out what the workflow is. So we have to make sure that while we're doing this, I'm essentially, the way I've configured that prototype PR right now essentially points, it points everything at staging, right? So it assumes you have access because you should have access to that staging repo, right? So it's landing what are quote unquote prod artifacts in the staging bucket, which is fine for now. But once we have more access, once that PR emerges, I'll have more access to actually land things within the prod bucket, right? So I'm not actually sure if the assumptions that I've made on some of the configuration are correct just yet. I'll have a better idea once it's moving. It's from project to project. But yeah, you're right. I do see a world where we can stand up something that is near prod, that people are willing to cover to have the new hotness, as opposed to
So as an example, to
worrying
make
too
it
much about the URLs.
concrete, Hannes had done a PR that disabled some checksum publication. This was like quite a while back, right?
Mhm.
Like we stripped those out, and people were like, "Oh no,
Yeah, a few months
we
ago.
depend on those files. All of those things, all of those published artifacts are API. People depend on them. So we'd either have to prove that we have all of these things, including these things that we don't want to have, or we make some sort of a split where you've got the old deprecated way for the next year or something, in addition to the new preferred way."
Yeah, we have to figure out where those things are. The checksum's not too bad because like we can, that's part of the code essentially. Like it determines based on, we added like essentially some conditional logic that will check if it's version. It will keep publishing. I believe it'll keep publishing the MD5s and SHA-1s until I think I set it to Kubernetes 118 or so. It'll keep publishing them until. So I'm not too concerned about. I'm not too concerned about like individual artifacts. What I'm concerned about is like the presentation of the entire blob, right? So for people who have scripts that are configured to go look for things in dl.kates.io, right? And our new prod is not dlkates.io, then they'll have problems, right? If people have scripts configured to look for things, which I in kates.gcr.io, right, for container images, which actually I ran into because something basically like if I'm doing the no mock flow and it's pointing at the, if you do like the no mock flow versus the mock flow, the no mock flow will set the bucket to will set the path to kates.gcr.io, right? And then it'll try to push an image to a place that it doesn't have access to, right? So there are little things like that that we have to be concerned with. I'm not too concerned about the individual artifacts because whatever we're publishing now will continue publishing, right? It's just where we're putting it.
So I agree it's suboptimal from an end user perspective to change the location. I am not sure how we can get both things we need or want to accomplish without maintaining a lot of old things for a year.
Yeah, I would love to not have to maintain these things for a year, to be honest. I would love to see the part that concerns me is that cut when we actually do the cutover. Like, what does it look like? What does it even look like? Like, I part of it is going to be changing DNS records, right? And that's just the name of the game. But I don't know. Because we also like there are certain parts of this flow that I can't test until those records are changed. Which I guess we can mock out the records to have a yeah, we can mock out the records too. This is not, I don't think it's impossible. We just have to think through a few more pieces. I know that gl.kates.io and kates.gcr.io are going to be problems, are going to be things that we have to solve. I don't think they're problems.
So I got another question back on the feature branch newly created and the warnings in the Slack channel about the branch fast forwards. Is there a way that we could? So I guess first we should.
Them?
Well, we should talk about how that branch is going to be managed. And another kind of meta issue that I'd like to talk about is how others of us can get involved in the hacking that you're doing. One of the PRs you showed has 12 commits, and you're marching forward. But is there work here that others could contribute? Would that be via a PR to that branch? And then how are we going to collaborate on that feature branch together? And if it's the basics around branch fast forward, I think we could do some automation like the other branches so that warning doesn't show up.
Yeah, so yes, no, maybe so is the short answer. Absolutely. So the whole point of the feature branch was to enable collaboration. The first mile of it is a little tricky to do with multiple people in the mix. So I'm trying to land that phase 0, where we get to the point um, where the tokens are in and also the accompanying Kates.io PR for granting access to those staging pieces, right? So for the release managers that are on the call, if you are part of the patch release team, you're part of the branch management team, the access that you've had to Kubernetes release tests has not changed. If you are a release manager associate, right? So you're kind of shadowing, learning all this stuff, and starting to kick down PRs and stuff like that. I created a new role on the Kubernetes release test project that will give you access to view the cloud builds and some of the GCS stuff, right? So that means the previous issue that we had of people wanting to shadow this role and not having the requisite access to at least even look at logs, like that should be gone. So any release manager associate on the call should take a moment to check out whether or not they can see the Google Cloud Build console, right? So part of that Kates Infra, Kates.io PR was to make sure that release managers, the elevated release managers, so the branch management and patch release team folks have access to do the things that I'm doing right now in the Kates staging release test project, and also make sure that we allow the release manager associates to view the stuff that I'm doing, right? And then the additional role of the admins would give us access, the release chairs access to edit the KMS stuff, right? So add secrets. So this will come up later when we actually add a GPG key so that we can sign the devs and RPMs before pushing them somewhere, right? So we need access to do that before we can do some of that stuff. I'm trying to lay the groundwork so that everyone can into that. And once that phase 0 lands, once the Kates.io PR is merged, and once that phase 0 lands, that will be, then you'll be able to work on the prototype branch. There's probably a lot of stuff that is unexplained, which I can walk through with people if they're interested in contributing to that. And there are also probably things that you, if you're not a release manager, you won't have access to. Just a heads up for the people on the call that might also be interested in working on this. So this is primarily going to be a work that's done by release manager associates and the rest of the release managers, just to be aware of that ahead of time. But yes, the whole point was to get this to point. The whole point of all of this was to get this to the point where multiple people could collaborate on it.
Those are my 3 questions. What questions do others have?
No questions? Nothing?
I mean, I have a ton of questions, but no specific one yet. But I will bug you on a couple of questions later.
Yeah, for sure. I know you started on slides, so I'm going to review some of that stuff this week.
Yeah, right now there is not that much to review, but hopefully soon.
Okay, so I guess so we didn't really have an agenda, but I guess my next, unless someone has a question, maybe anywhere, anybody. Okay, all right. So my next topic, we have been discussing this for a while, and it's just kind of been in the background, and we're like, one day it'd be really, really nice to do this, but we'll see when we get there. Is refactoring the all of the bash tools that we have in Kubernetes release and turning them into Go tools, right? So Daniel and Sasha have graciously volunteered as tribute to start work on that. So Sasha, I think last week put up a PR for a skeleton of the push build tool. I also have a kind of test PR for the branch fast forward tool. So I was going to write it up in an issue, but I guess I'll say it now. My vision for this, Tim and I were talking about this last week. I think what I would like to see is something of a toolbox, right? Something, a singular tool that does a bunch of these functions. So subcommands on the same tool. So something like kube release, right? Kube release FF, right? So kube release FF would do the fast forwarding, and kube release push build or kube release push or something like that would do the push build functionality, right? The reason I'm thinking of aggregating these into a single command is so that we can, you can see that there are, and I speak as someone who is not like a mega Go hacker or anything like that. I just kind of bang my head on this stuff until it works. So you can see within the release repo, and as well as across a bunch of different repos, everyone has kind of a different style, right? How they organize functions, how they organize libraries, how they organize, how they decide what, even like down to choosing a logger, right? And you can see that some of those decisions are reflected? Are there multiple reflections of decisions within the Kubernetes release repo? What I want to make sure of is that we do our best to not duplicate work, right? So where we can use the same thing, we do, right? And if we have exactly, George, a style guide, right? I don't have enough style to write a style guide, but I think we can probably beg, borrow, and steal from a few other places. But the idea would be to have something similar to, if you think about the way that kubectl is designed, right? It's essentially, or if you think of cluster CTL, right? They're essentially designed where there's a top level, there's a root, and then there are a set of subcommands within that, right? So whether it's apply or run or, or edit or, so on and so forth, doing the same with the release tools, right? So that way we wire up a single logger. We use similar libraries. The branch fast forward PR that I have open, you can start to see that we break out into a package util that has Git and then common. And then the ideas there are to replicate the parts that we need from the tool, the libraries that are in bash that are already in lib. So lib common.sh, lib gitlib.sh, and lib releaselib.sh, right? Those libraries are imported into all of the bash tools that we use to stage release push. So it's important that we consider that design as we move into the Go stuff too, right? The part of what I want to do is make sure that we don't try to replicate all of it. I want to let the tools that we are building define the functions and methods that we need within those libraries on the Go side, right? So you can also see that tools that we don't necessarily use in the primary release process, so the staging, the build, stage, and release bits, also have need for similar functions, right? So like the release notes tool, right? The release notes tool has a Git library within it, right? And some of it, some of the functions that are defined there are the same as the ones that we need for the bash tools or for the rewrite of the bash tools, right? So something that I plan to do within that fast forward PR is essentially just unify those two, right? And then kind of, so again, we're gonna build a toolbox. I think that's the right move to do so that we're not contending with conflicting styles. Thoughts? Cool. George, if you don't mind, would you open a ticket for, or ticket issue, Jira flashbacks. Would you open an issue in Kubernetes release regarding a style guide? Just so we don't lose track of that. I think that's a great idea. Now, once the, so Sasha made the suggestion that I should just land my PR so that we could all collaborate on it, and I agree. So I'm going to be wrapping that up this week, and pushing that up. So we'll kind of, he left a review on that. If anybody else wants to review the branch fast forward one, they can. And there are a few things left to do. There are a bunch of to-dos in there, but pushing it in sooner rather than later will give us an opportunity to collaborate on it. The next tool that I think is probably the most important one is push build. Push build is the tool that is responsible for, as the name implies, pushing builds of Kubernetes up to the staging repos. So that tool is leveraged heavily in the Kubernetes build and the CI Kubernetes build and CI Kubernetes build fast jobs, as well as in a bunch of other places that maybe we can't track down. Maybe it's used by external tools as well. So I think it's probably the next most important one to take down. There was an issue opened by Ben a little while back, I think probably last release, about moving push build out of Kubernetes release. And right now that's impossible because it depends on the common git lib and release lib libraries that I was mentioning before. So getting it to the point where it's a Go tool and it's importable would be pretty cool, because then people are no longer dependent on, well, they're still dependent on our repo, but they're no longer dependent on libraries that are written in Bash. So I think it would be a step forward. From there, we have to, I think the next ones we'll probably have to look at are starting to think about Anago and GCP Manager. So for people who are not aware of Anago and GCP Manager, Anago is our release tool. It's our granddaddy release tool that is 1,800 lines, 1,868 lines last I checked of Bash, and then GCP Manager is essentially a wrapper for like Google Cloud Build substitutions on top of Anago, right? What I see happening now that I have taken a look at the image builder is that we try to chip away at the pieces of GCP Manager and replace them with that image builder, right? I also had a chat with Catherine about the image builder, or what I'm gonna refer to now as GC Builder at this point, because I realize that the way we've tweaked it, it's generally useful now. I think what we're going to end up doing is we'll have a co-maintained GC Builder from between SIG release and SIG testing. We'll pull that out into its own repo, right? So this will be a tool that you can use to essentially it's just sugar on top of it's sugar on top of GC build executions, right? So the advantage of that is more and more test jobs are starting to use that, but it's not in a place that's easily discoverable. It's also not in a place that we like version, right? So it'd be nice to have the tool in one place where like you understand the set of dependencies. They don't depend on, won't have to depend on everything that lives in test infra, because test infra is a lot. And you kind of require the top level Go mod for test infra to build that tool, right? So moving away from that, having a cleaner set of dependencies on that tool, and then working through our test jobs, because this has the potential to replace, if you're familiar with the scenarios in test infra, it has the huge potential to replace those scenarios, right? So I've already proven that we can replace the Kubernetes build scenario with that builder. And then the next ones, we'd probably look at doing like the Kubernetes EDE and the Kubernetes and the execute scenarios. So if anyone has no idea what I'm talking about, the scenarios and test infra. So Kubernetes / test infra / scenarios. Yeah, and then there are a set of scenarios that are Python scripts that that basically are the underlying tools for a lot of our build jobs, right? So the scenarios are built into the Bootstrap image, and if you're familiar with the Bootstrap image has been deprecated for some time, but we still heavily depend on that image. It's also the image that's built. It's also the image that the Kubekins EDE image is built on top of, right? So there's like there's quite a bit of mess underneath some of these things, and if we use this tool and we clean this tool up and we've got a bunch of people working on it, then I think we've got the opportunity to finally deprecate things like Bootstrap, things like Kubekins EDE. And what's kind of cool about this is that we get away from running jobs within Prow. Not strictly correct, right? We get away from executing Prow jobs that run on a Prow cluster, right? And then we move to a point where we're executing Prow jobs that execute Google Cloud Build runs that run on ephemeral infrastructure, right? And that's a place that we want to be, right? We're still getting to read out the logs, but we have a consistent framework for submitting these jobs. We have less of a dependency on people building images and more of a dependency on, and more of an allowance to essentially define, just specify an image that is already built, right? Not depend on any of the test infrastructure outside of submitting the job, right? And I think that's a pretty cool place to be at. So I know I'm throwing stuff at people now, but if you have questions, let me know.
I'm going to throw a couple of links, I guess, for Daniel and Sasha. I don't know if you've seen these things. I'll put them in the minutes. But Bart Smikla, who is doing work on Kate's info, was also looking at some of this common bash code and was trying to figure out what it does. Initially, he thought he was going to kind of help fix some issues or do some cleaning up and refactoring, and it's such a mess that it's hard to even understand what's there. So he was looking at documenting what's there. And I think to some extent, maybe we don't want to just take something that's there as a bash function and make it a Go function. Like we want to, I think the theme today is like split, cut over. There's a lot of things we want to just leave behind, but at the same time, there's a lot of, when you look at that bash code, I think you probably will come away with the sense that there is actually some intelligent thought that went into it, and we don't want to just completely disregard that blindly and fall into traps and eventually in a year or two discover, oh, we have Go code that exactly matches the old bash code and are unhappy. So like we want to be able to learn from it, but the how to do that is complicated. So he created a set of docs describing what he sees there and the interdependencies of things, and that also will inform a bit as we try to decouple things. It should help give a reminder of other things that are using, maybe point at some patterns that we could replace maybe with something for a better pattern. I don't know. So there's like 6 or 7 links I'll paste into the notes.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, so the big part about this stuff is again the libraries. There are a lot of things that we do. There are a lot of things that we do in those libraries that are consistent across each of the tools that we use. So if you take the common library, stuff that we do is like we do a log init, right? And like we don't need a log init anymore if we're using a logger in Go, right? You know, so that's like a function that goes out of the window, right? And then you've got things like clean exit, right? Clean exit basically wraps exit codes, make sure that things are provides a reasonable exit code, provides some sort of error message, and you know, and that's stuff that you know is handled by the OS, you know, the OS import, right, on the Go side, right, you know, and then you've got you take the gitlib, and gitlib, like people have written Git libraries already in Go. Right, we don't have to write our own. We can leverage those. So that's something that we won't have to, you know, fully rewrite. You know, and then the release stuff, if we decide to go the route of, you know, so the release stuff, a lot of the stuff is doing things within, you know, leveraging the G-Cloud CLI tool or the GSUtil CLI tool. Right, so those are ones that do functions within Google Cloud Platform, whether it's copying things from one bucket to another, or from your local to a bucket, or from your bucket to local, or uploading, you know, authenticating against using your Google Cloud credentials to authenticate against the GCR repo registries, right, or making sure that your Docker client within the GCP run can leverage your credentials, things like that, right? And again, there are libraries for that, right? So there's a lot of stuff that we don't want or need to repeat. So kind of the goal around some of this is to make sure that we are letting the tools, as opposed to the libraries, inform the way we structure this code, right? So I want to understand what branch fast forward is doing, and then I want branch fast forward to inform the way I structure the library around Git and around the common and around and then I want Anago or the rewritten version of Anago or the rewritten version of push build to inform the release process, right? How are we staging artifacts, right? And then that should again inform the way we're building these libraries. It shouldn't be like Tim said, we really do not want to get into a place where we're like, hey, lib common, okay, copy paste, comment out. All right, what is the Go equivalent of this structure, right? We want to make sure that we're not doing that kind of stuff. This is not a copy paste thing. This is now that we're moving to something that is actually extensible and testable and all that good stuff. Let's also make sure that we're improving on the current state of things, right? Yeah.
I just have a comment on that. I mean, I'm full in on rewriting those things and making them as small as possible. And I think if we manage to do that, we can also or we should aim to use as much as we can from the tools we have. For example, from GCB. I could imagine, for example, a tool that does nothing else than, as you said, pushing something to GCS or pulling something down. And then we can even create a reusable GCP task or whatever it's called in that context. So we can even reuse the GCP building block and push as much as we can to the tools we have available, and not, what I'm trying to say is we should aim for not rewriting the whole 1800 codes of Anago in one monolithic Go application again, but just splitting it out as much as we can.
Yeah, for sure. And like I was mentioning, that GC Builder tool is essentially what we would be using as a replacement for GCP Manager, right? So like if you look at K release build cloud.yaml, that's the build config that we submit to GCP via the proud job, right? And again, if you scroll up in the notes, all of that stuff is linked. How I connected each of those pieces is linked because I didn't know how to do it before. So again, a lot of the stuff is me just bashing my head on something until it works. But yeah, so like what's really cool about that is like this is generally useful to a bunch of people, not just us, not just for building images. Like everyone could potentially do this for the jobs that they submit on test infra. And if that's the case, then why are we using GCP Manager, right? So I want to get to that point where we have that full realization, and then also other projects are able to leverage the same tools that we are. I think that some of the improvements that we have, I think that some of the things that we've tried to do are some of the things that we're just trying to wade through have been traditionally not touched because they're scary, they're not documented, right? Yeah. They're scary, they're not documented, and a breakage of one of those things is going to lead to breakage of the entire project, right? So like that is a scary proposition. So I think if we're building more and more tools that allow people to leverage them in a way that doesn't have the potential to break all of Kubernetes, then people are more likely to contribute to them. And what we want is more contributors everywhere, right? So working on our stuff, working on their stuff, working on our stuff and their stuff at the same time. I think that, I think that building stuff in the open and in repos that are not the Kubernetes release repo is going to enable a lot more collaboration.
So we're coming up on the top of the hour. Stephen, it sounds like you're potentially in a place where you're not really able to talk much anymore. I want to throw it back to others on the call to ask any questions, make any comments, but finish things out for the meeting today. Sasha, Daniel in particular, any comments on the bash stuff right now?
Oh no, I'm fine with that. Yeah, it sounds like a good plan. I definitely think that translating the bash directly to Go would not be a long-term solution, and potentially not even a good short-term solution. So it sounds like there might be some design work that needs to kind of like preempt any of the actual code work that happens.
I think to some extent we may end up doing that as a little more agile, iterative thing. Some of the stuff is complicated enough to understand what's there today. So yes, define a small thing we need, get consensus that it would be useful, get going on that. I don't see us being able to do a whole global picture. Here are all the tools we believe we need upfront. But yeah, definitely we want to see design work happening and documentation, test cases, all of those things that beyond just landing some Go code and PRs.
Yes, documentation is key. I think, one of the things that we've had trouble with over the past 1 million cycles essentially is that, sorry, so many cabs, is that it's, again, they're scary tools. They have the potential to break a lot of things, and we don't understand how to use them. Some of them are documented, some of them are not. Some of the documentation does not match what they currently do, right? So there are lots of problems there. So if you're working on something new, or you're working on something old and you found a thing that you all of a sudden understand and you didn't before, write it down, file a PR, right? That'll go a long way for the next person that's coming after you. For the release managers on the call, I owe you an onboarding doc. I'm going to include the image builder, code base tour, as well as the recording of the 117 alpha 3 cycle. And since the code base tour and the staging part of the cycle went so well, I'm thinking that maybe if people come up with the topics, we can maybe spend the last half of all of the release engineering meetings or some of the release engineering meetings doing code base walkthroughs, if that sounds like something people would be interested in. We also have the beta 0 coming up tomorrow. The beta 0 is an interesting release because it also involves the branch cuts. It also involves the creation of the test jobs. So I'm thinking that we can, I'll do another recording, right? But this time the recording will start from the release stage instead of the stage. The release part instead of the stage part, right? So we'll get more of the flow, and then we can also walk through the PRs that are required to create branches and cut over the variants and so on and so forth, right? Sound good? I'm gonna assume that sounds awesome.
All right, we are at the top of the hour, so I'm going to go ahead and call the meeting, and I'll make sure the YouTube upload happens later today. Thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you. Have a good day.